CBS News is joining 250 news organizations who are committing to a week of climate coverage.
A new global initiative by the Nation and Columbia Journalism Review to improve global coverage of the
to raise awareness of our changing planet as we head into next week's Climate Action Summit in New York
failing
City.
to connect the dots between climate change and extreme weather.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. Planet SOS. Climate change was breaking news long ago. Why have the mainstream media been so slow and so poor in covering it? The inside story from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. The locals say they get a raw deal from news outlets on the outside, so they've taken to covering their story themselves. An Al Jazeera journalist has been in jail in Egypt for 1,000 days now and still has not been charged with committing a crime. And as Chinese kids return to school, there are lessons to be learned from the state. Record heat waves in Europe and Africa. Droughts in southern India on an unprecedented scale. Hurricanes more frequent and violent than ever, and wildfires in, of all places, the Arctic. The global news media are, after decades of looking the other way, finally waking up to what scientists have long called an emergency: climate change. Take covering climate now. It's an alliance of more than 300 media outlets, including this one, currently running 1 week's worth of climate coverage in the lead-up to a summit on the subject in New York City. The shortfall in the coverage of climate change and the shortcomings expose the ugly, irresponsible side of modern journalism, particularly the corporate kind. The chase for ratings and revenues mean the media are complicit in, and not just observers of, an economy dependent on fossil fuels. And that's a big part of the problem. Our starting point this week, once again, is the planet Earth. A global media consortium, a journalistic collective, the size and reach of which is commensurate to the story. News agencies like Bloomberg, AFP in France, and Getty Images. U.S. television networks, Univision and CBS. India's News 18. SVT in Sweden, and Al Jazeera in Qatar. Asahi Shimbun and La Repubblica, the most widely read newspapers in Japan and Italy, respectively. More than 300 media outlets on 6 continents, with a combined audience of more than 1 billion people, all brought together by 2 American publications, The Nation magazine and the Columbia Journalism Review, to talk about one issue: climate change.
I thought there is a critical mass of journalists out there who want to be doing more and better climate coverage. And that's what led to this project covering climate now. And it has been remarkable to see the way that so many outlets have stepped up. Big outlets, small outlets, radio, TV, print, online, and all over the world.
So much of the climate journalism that we do is about our country. It's very insular, and this is a global issue, and especially a lot of the polluters cross borders. Today I was reading a story about sewage systems in Philadelphia, and we have the exact same problems in Johannesburg, here where we are. So this seemed like an opportunity to join up in newsrooms and tell our audience for a week that here's an issue that the whole world is dealing with.
The consortium's strategy was to have all of its members churning out a week's worth of environmental reporting leading up to September 23rd and the start of a major climate conference in New York City. For participants like India's Hindustan Times and South Africa's Mail and Guardian, the core subject is the same, the stories markedly different.
So in South Africa, one of the big problems we have is we have such a big carbon footprint as a nation, right?
But if you look at India, our per capita emissions are extremely low. They are lower than the world average.
Our power utility, Eskom, then Sasol, which is a petrochemicals company, and then a few other industries. These are all relics of the apartheid regime, where it built these incredibly polluting industries that affect the communities that live next to them. And they also have a huge impact on releasing carbon emissions.
It's good to put a human face to the climate change story, and I think this is an opportunity to do that. And at the same time, track the conference in New York, track it as effectively as possible, look at what the government here is doing and what it plans to announce.
As impressive as the consortium's joint output has been, the question begged is, what took them so long? The New York Times had this page-one story on a scientist working for NASA predicting much of what we are seeing today: record heat waves, droughts, and sea level rises if global warming went unchecked. That piece was written 31 years ago, in 1988. What followed has been not just a failing of governments, but of news media as well, part of which is a continuing failure to connect the dots. U.S. broadcast networks ABC, CBS, and NBC all recently gorged on the coverage of Hurricane Dorian.
Some of the wind gusts here in the Outer Banks, over 80, 90 miles an hour.
But of the 216 segments they put to air over a one-week stretch, only one mentioned the possible causal context: climate change. One. Very few journalists have covered the climate change beat since that New York Times article in 1988. The Guardian's George Monbiot is among them. Why has it taken this long and this concerted a lobbying effort to get the media outlets where they need to be on this story?
If you look at the billionaire press, the newspapers owned by billionaires, they have a very clear interest in not emphasizing climate breakdown, because doing so directly offends the commercial interests of the billionaire class as a whole. In the broadcast media, it's long been perceived as counter-aspirational.
Today, I'm house hunting on the stunning Caribbean island of Antigua.
The programs they like to make are all about wonderful houses and amazing things you can buy and great holidays you can go on. And climate breakdown and environmental breakdown more generally are the spectre at the feast, saying actually all this apparent progress is progress towards disaster. There's been a layer of top executives in the media who have been not just indifferent to these issues, but actively hostile to them. I've met journalists from Mexico, from India, from Southeast Asia, who all tell me the same thing. They themselves, as journalists, are desperate to cover the issues, but the senior figures within their organizations just keep nixing it. They keep saying no.
Because, in the end, money talks. And when it does, many media outlets listen, and some go quiet. Since the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016, the 5 biggest publicly traded oil and gas companies have spent around $1 billion trying to shift the narrative on climate change. Some of that is spent on lobbying that happens out of the public eye, but it also pays for the branded content advertising you may have seen on a newspaper's website.
And should the weather change, yet again, our natural gas can step in to keep the power flowing and the lights shining.
Or the ads that have grown common on the American airwaves. Slick, feel-good messaging.
It's getting the attention you deserve, but the privacy you desire.
At a time when the standard of covering climate change is finally improving, advertising often works against the journalism. And with media starved of revenue like never before, news outlets face a dilemma. Take the ad money or leave it.
You have to rely on advertising. So at the Mail and Guardian, we have a strict divide between the commercial side and the editorial side, but we can veto adverts if we think they're not in line with our editorial policy or they are lies, basically. So we do try and hold our adverts to a better standard, but you know, you need money to do journalism. So at the moment, this is where the money is.
I want to talk about something you wrote way back in 2007. The editorials urge us to cut our emissions. The ads urge us to raise them. Do you see a tension between those two imperatives?
The tension is almost overwhelming sometimes. I get a lot of complaints from my readers about it, and it's right across all the media. You get the advertisements pushing us towards what we know is disaster. I would like to see media outlets ceasing to take advertising for oil companies, for gas companies, for cars, for planes, for holidays which require flights. And I don't think that's too much to ask. These are industries which should be on the way out anyway.
As impressive as the list of companies that took part in all that climate change coverage is, the list does not tell the full story. Consider the organizations you do not see here. the ones that chose not to take part, for reasons ranging from the journalistic to the ideological to the merely commercial.
I did make efforts to reach out to most of the biggest U.S. news organizations to invite them to be part of covering climate now. The New York Times has declined, the Washington Post declined, the Wall Street Journal declined, the Los Angeles Times declined, CNN declined, NBC News declined, ABC News declined. They did not want to look like they were part of a campaign or trying to push a certain agenda on their readers. We differ with that point of view. We think that it fundamentally misses a key aspect of journalism, which is to try and cut through the fog and tell citizens, here's what you need to know about your world, and here's what you can do about it.
We're looking at other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Meenakshi Ravi. Meena, the media in Egypt are severely restricted under the government there, but there's one very public dissenting voice going after the president himself. What can you tell us about him?
This person who's speaking out, Richard, is very well known in Egypt. He's a film and TV actor. His name is Muhammad Ali. And over the past few weeks, he's been posting numerous half-hour-long videos on Facebook and YouTube. And he's doing it from Spain.
ولكن للأسف الجهة اللي أنا بتعامل معاها وهي القوات المسلحة هي اللي اضطرتني أعمل ده.
Now, it's not surprising Ali felt he had to leave Egypt in order to say some of the things he's saying. He's gone where few others in Egypt would dare to go. Ali had extensive dealings with the Egyptian military and says he saw up close clear cases of corruption and embezzlement by President Sisi, his wife, and their inner circle. These videos, Richard, have been going crazy online. They've been getting millions of views.
And many of those views are within Egypt. So how are the Egyptian media dealing with this, given that criticism of the president there is such a no-no?
Well, these videos have been seen as so incendiary that President Sisi himself came out to respond. He was at a conference in Cairo when he spoke about Ali's allegations.
فنيجي نتكلم والموجة تعلى والحقه ده بيعمل قصور طبعا. أنا ببني في العاصمة دولة لا مؤاخذة الدنيا كلها هتتفرج عليه.
We haven't seen such a public challenge against President Sisi before. Now, that's in part due to the fact that the suppression and targeting of independent journalism has been so effective. Amongst the hundreds of journalists who are currently in jail in Egypt, there's Al Jazeera's own Mahmoud Hussein, who's been held without any charge for more than 1,000 days.
All right, the other story we're looking at is in Great Britain, the continuing chaos over Brexit. And David Cameron, the Prime Minister who set this whole process off with that referendum call 3 years ago, decides to choose this particular moment to launch a publicity tour.
Yeah, I mean, Cameron's been all over the British airwaves, and he's promoting his autobiography.
It was the moment he was finally in front of the camera and under the spotlight.
The leadership election collapsed, and so it came to an end very quickly. But I hated leaving the job that I loved, serving the country I love.
He's appeared on just about any TV or radio platform that will have him, and is even the subject of a two-part BBC documentary on his time in office. Now, Cameron is the Prime Minister who called that referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, even though he said he himself is anti-Brexit. History probably won't treat him kindly, but the British media largely have, helping him sell copies of his book, which haven't exactly been flying off the shelves in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Meena. Consider what you know or think you know about the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, those sprawling hillside communities that are as synonymous with Rio as the city's iconic beaches. Perhaps you see favelas as the Brazilian media and many international news outlets have depicted them. Lawless communities, virtual no-go zones for police, where the only realistic solution is a security show of force. That prevailing view that the favelas need to be brought under control plays well for two politicians in particular, President Jair Bolsonaro and Rio's governor, Wilson Witzel. Both have given police more authority to use lethal force in the favelas through an ongoing shoot-to-kill policy, and they routinely defend officers who kill on the job. However, there's an alternative media narrative coming out of the favelas that has emerged through community-based journalistic collectives. They use video footage posted on social media to document police violence and security abuses to counter the dominant mainstream media narrative on one of Brazil's most important stories. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafa now on two of those collectives, Papo Reto and Mare Vive, and the work they do.
They begin early in the morning when the favela is asleep or getting ready for work. Police raids that come without warning and turn residents into hostages in their own homes.
The first sound of my day is of a helicopter and gunshots. It's very disturbing. Then, we speak with residents from all over the complex. People give guidance as a method of defense. Be careful when going to such and such street. The police tank is there. We then curate the information and decide where to share it.
They turn the favela into a war zone, and we share information in order to minimize the damage to people's lives. Not only physical damage, but psychological too, which is more serious. For the residents, our Facebook page works as an information tool so they can feel safe.
The importance of these media collectives is immense, mainly to fill a void left by the mass media. And why is that? Because the press doesn't enter there. Because these are territories where the state is not present.
They are the favela's eyes and ears. Media collectives like Mare Vivi and Papo Reto fill an information void. One that's especially dangerous during the near-daily military raids in the favelas. The collectives gather photos, videos, and information in real time and share them with residents on Facebook and WhatsApp. For decades, Rio's security forces have operated with almost total impunity in the favelas.
Preste atenção quem é que o senhor está filmando, porque foi a gente que prendeu o gordinho, prendeu um monte de
Eu não quero saber quem o senhor prendeu. Eu não quero saber que o senhor não quero saber.
O senhor tem que tomar cuidado.
Filma isso.
Facing off with residents, occupying and invading homes. But not without pushback from the media collectives.
Olha, tiveram inúmeras situações assim.
There were several instances where we used our videos to get justice. There was the case of Eduardo de Jesus, a 10-year-old boy who was shot by a soldier. The first thing the residents did was call Papo Reto. We wanted our video to serve as evidence of the crime scene, to avoid someone moving the body or placing a gun in the child's hand. The policeman wouldn't allow us in the area. But we are from the favela. The favela people have their own resources. Another resident let us go up on his roof and we filmed everything from above. Our footage was used by the public defender in Eduardo's case and it made news across the country.
Rio's favelas are more than 100 years old. They are impoverished communities where the state has historically shown little interest in residents' well-being. In the 1980s, the drug trade pushed its way into the favelas, trapping the population there between brutal warring gangs and police forces with a reputation for violence. Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, and Rio's governor, Wilson Witzel, both support more extreme action.
E se fosse com autorização da ONU em outros lugares do mundo, nós tínhamos autorização para mandar míssil naquele local e explodir aquelas pessoas.
The governor recently took part in a police operation.
Acabou a bagunça. Vamos colocar ordem na casa. Vambora.
Residents say helicopters are used to fire indiscriminately and launch grenades on the favelas. Rio's militarized security forces now kill an average of 5 people per day. Brazil is at war, government officials say, a war on drugs that inside the favelas feels more like a war on the poor.
When they use the war metaphor to justify this kind of action, they forget that in a war there's a ceasefire, a curfew, a series of actions that should prevent the war becoming a genocide. With Bolsonaro as president and Witzel as Rio's governor, we have a synchrony of a state genocide policy. We have a governor who wants to be Rambo.
Alguém de fuzil é uma ameaça iminente e tem que ser abatido.
And it needs to be said, when Witzel applies a security policy in which success is measured by the number of bodies left on the floor, it's clear how this government's focus is on barbarism.
How can anyone end violence if you increase the number of people killed? Rio's police have been more lethal than during the 5 governments that came before. So how can anyone solve security issues if no one invests in inclusion policies? Police operations have always existed in the favelas. Death has always existed. Unfortunately, that's all the favelas are used for. They only see the favelas through the sights of their rifles.
Brazil's mainstream media has a troubled relationship with the favelas.
Hoje foi o 5º dia seguido de terror na favela da Rocinha, no Rio de Janeiro.
The majority of Brazilians and the vast majority of the people of the favelas are of African descent. The faces in the media and on the airwaves are disproportionately white. When the media do report on the favelas, it's for all the wrong reasons.
Bandidos ostentam à luz do dia armas, drogas e joias.
The terminology can be problematic.
Cada vez mais esses canalhas perdem a capacidade de serem humanos. Nem bichos são, porque bicho também não faz isso.
And official voices are often privileged over voices from within the favela. Many journalists have also embedded with security forces, entering the favelas in armored tanks, known to locals as a caveirão, or big skull. However, the dangers for journalists covering this beat are real. In 2002, Tim Lopes, a reporter for Brazil's largest TV network, Globo, was tortured to death in what was called a macabre ritual of violence, a trademark of the notorious drug lord he was investigating, dubbed Ilias the Madman by Rio's tabloids. The brutality of his murder shocked Brazilians, not least news editors, who have been reluctant to send reporters into the favelas ever since. Vinicius Donola was a colleague of Tim Lopes.
Veja, eu não sou assessor de
Look,
imprensa.
I'm not a press or PR officer for the mass media companies, but we need to be fair here. How can I, as a journalist, report those stories if I can't go in? How? I need to access these people's realities. And what's the reality that we hear about? It's violence.
Os soldados do tráfico passam dia e noite armados, sempre à espera de uma guerra.
Due to the impossibility of access, despite the tremendous richness from the favelas, we get just one story about them. This is not coverage. To cover is to be there, but we are not. For instance, this interview is being recorded in a posh neighborhood in the South Zone. Would we be able to record this inside a favela? We would need authorization.
Teríamos que ter uma autorização.
It's very common to hear TV journalists say that they don't go into the favela because it's too violent. We can't deny some of that is true. This interview, for instance, we should be doing it inside Alemão, but today was an intense day of gunfights. It would be irresponsible to tell you, come, let's do it there. If a journalist wants a scoop from inside the favela, they should listen to a favela person. But what we say doesn't have credit.
A nossa fala não tem crédito.
Por isso, that's why Papoeto and Mare Vivi are fundamental. Because they have a direct link with everyday lives. They listen to the residents, they give visibility and amplify those voices. To have alternative communication tools like Mare Vivi and Papoeto speaking out against the logic of war and the dehumanization of black bodies in the favelas is fundamental.
É fundamental.
Rio's favelados, the people of the favela, face a political establishment hell-bent on treating them as a hostile population, as well as media outlets hindered by difficulties of access but also by bias and a tendency to peddle a narrative of war. Amidst all this, the media collectives, Mare Vivi, Papoeto, and the numerous others across Rio tell stories from the inside, broadcasting a reality seen through the lens of the favela.
And finally, it's that time of year in many countries, back to school time. For students in China, the first lesson of each year comes from the state and Beijing's media apparatus. As classes begin, students and their parents are required to watch a television program. Produced by the Ministry of Education and the national broadcaster CCTV, the show is part of a government campaign to, quote, unify ideology, unquote. This year's theme, patriotism. An hour and a half of flag waving, history celebrating, military cheering, and achievement listing. For any other authoritarian states and leaders who might be watching, it's really a lesson in the art of propaganda. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
我们的开学第一天，总是要在校园里举行升国旗、奏国歌的重要仪式。那在这里也想问问同学们，你们知道新中国的第一面5星红旗是在什么时候升起的吗？